Welcome to Financial Planning Explained. I'm your host, Mike Menninger, certified financial planner, owner, and founder of Menninger Associates Financial Planning. I'm joined with one of my associates, Nick DeVito, also a CFP and also an equity owner and partner of my firm. We're picking up the second part of discussing pensions. In our first episode, we talked mostly about the formation of pension, the history of pensions, and we spent a lot of time on the lump sum versus taking the pension itself. So we'll pick up with the different type of options. I'm going to hand that off to Nick. But before I go there, one of the questions that I know a lot of people are always concerned with, and I think Bethlehem Steel, because it's relatively local, is what sticks out in people's minds, because Bethlehem Steel went bankrupt and they had a pension. Okay. So what happens with pensions? Pensions are regulated by the government. In fact, it's the Department of Labor. All pension plans contribute an insurance premium to the Pension Benefit and Guarantee Corporation, which is PBGC. So all pensions contribute to that, because if a company goes bankrupt, then what happens to the pension? And typically what will happen is that the PBGC comes in and kind of rescues it. However, the benefit is typically reduced, and it is reduced substantially, which, by the way, can factor in to, do I take the pension or do I take the lump sum? Because once you get the lump sum, they can't take it away from you. But anyway, so Nick, I'm going to pass it back to you, because typically there's a lot of options that are afforded to somebody. If I was to get a pension for $4,000 a month, that's just for me. That is what's referred to as the single life annuity. But what if I'm married and want to be able to have a benefit for my spouse? That's where you then pick up all these other type of options. So I'll let you pick up on it.
Yeah, and in the first episode, we really kind of just talked about the more so the annuity versus the lump sum. But within the annuity portion, there's additional options for you to choose from. And to Mike's point, they really come into play, especially if you're married. So the second option you'll typically see is going to be the joint and survivor. What that is you are electing and saying, okay, my benefit's $4,000 a month, but that's if it was just me. So if I pass away, my spouse is left with nothing. The joint and survivor will allow you to elect, and it's a percentage. So you can say, I want my spouse to receive 100% of what I was receiving. I want them to receive 50%, 75%. And a lot of times you can pick anywhere in between that if you want. But what you're going to see, and it makes sense, if the pension just for me is $4,000, and I'm saying I want my spouse to get 100% of what I was getting, well, they're not going to give me $4,000 anymore, because now they're insuring it for two. It's two people's lives that they're looking at. So it's going to be reduced. And obviously, the higher percentage you choose for your spouse to get, the lower the monthly amount's going to be. If I choose 50% versus 100%, well, my benefit's going to be higher at the 50%, because they know they're only having to pay my spouse out 50% when I pass. What they do factor in when they're making these calculations is the age of your spouse.
And gender.
Yep. So if your spouse is older, you're probably going to be receiving a higher benefit for you, because the way it's all actuarially based. So if you have an older spouse, the chances of them passing away before you, depending on the age and gender, if we're talking about age here, is a little bit a higher likelihood. So if that's the case, they're going to be willing to give you more, because the likelihood of them actually having to pay out your spouse is lower. The flip side of that, if your spouse is much younger than you, well, then they're probably going to be giving you a lower monthly payment, because the chances of you passing away first is higher, and then they're going to have to be paying them for a longer period of time. So that's the joint and survivor, and that makes a lot of sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about the planning opportunities around that. Well, when do I do 100? When do I do 50? When do I do 75? Really depends on your situation, but just know that they're out there. You also have what's referred to as period certain. What that is you're guaranteeing that someone will be receiving that payment for a certain period of time. That could be 10 years, that could be 20 years. And obviously they're going to be adjusting the amount that they're going to give you based on that. If you're saying, you know what, I want to do a 20-year period certain, well, that amount's going to be lower than if you say, okay, I want to do 10-year period certain. The period certain is a way to guarantee that someone is going to be receiving that benefit, whether it's you, whether it's your spouse, or whether it's a beneficiary.
So to elaborate on what he had just said, using that $4,000, if you have a male retiring at the age of 65, who would otherwise get $4,000 a month, if they wanted a 10-year period certain, that number might be $3,800 a month. Why? So they take a look at the actuarial likelihood of a male age 65 dying within 10 years. So what happens is that you identify a beneficiary. It doesn't have to be your spouse. It could be a child. It could be anybody. But what happens is that if I say 10 years and they reduce it to $3,800 a month, that doesn't mean at the end of 10 years, I stop getting money. I will get $3,800 a month for the rest of my life. But what it does is if I die at the end of year 3, whoever is my named beneficiary is going to get $3,800 a month from years 3 to year 10. Or if I did a 20-year, that might reduce it to $3,600, at which point, same thing applies. I'm going to get $3,600 for the rest of my life. But if I die anytime within 20 years, then whoever I name my beneficiary will also get $3,600. But at the end of the 20 years, it's done. A little seen one is what's referred to as the pop-up. The pop-up, or there's 2 different ones. I don't remember what the name of it is, but a pop-up often is if I name my spouse as a beneficiary, a 100% beneficiary. So instead of me getting $4,000 a month, I name my spouse as the 100% beneficiary, which reduces my payout to $3,500. A pop-up is usually defined as a 5-year period. If my spouse dies within the first 5 years, I immediately go back from $3,500 to $4,000. And now I'm getting $4,000 for the rest of my life. So basically what that does is for me, who's taking the pension, is I want to preserve the pension for my spouse. But if my spouse dies prematurely within whatever that defined period of time is, I'm not going to be penalized by taking $3,500 for the rest of my life. What they're going to do is they're going to bring me right back to the $4,000. Now, if it happened 3 years later, they're not going to go back 3 years and pay me the extra $500 a month. I just pop up to $4,000 for the rest of my life, but I have no beneficiary anymore. So if I die, the money's gone. The other thing I've seen them do is offer, again, I don't remember the term, if there is even a term, but I've seen them say designing something. Okay, such that if I am age 60 and retire, they give me the ability to take, instead of $4,000, they might give me $6,000 per month to age 65. But then after age 65, my $4,000 drops to $3,000. And then it runs $3,000 for the rest of my life after that. Why do they do some silly things like that? Of course, it's actuarially calculated. I struggle with that word actuarially. I get it once in a while. I get better at it. But it is actuarially calculated. So they say, well, gee, if they're giving me $6,000 a month for 5 years, well, then they gave me extra. Now they're going to reduce it based upon what my life expectancy is going to be. Why do they do things like that? Well, if I retire at the age of 60, then basically I'm paying for Medicare for 5 years, and I might need that additional income. I've seen it to age 62. 65 is a common age because of Medicare, and also because, again, the antiquity of this is 65 used to be full retirement age, but they'll give it to you a certain point because they assume that you're not collecting Social Security either. So that gives the flexibility for the pension recipient who does want that income and realizes that they need more income until such time that they're either on Medicare or on Social Security. It gives them more income. And that's a pretty nifty thing. Tough to map out for running retirement income models, but jokingly, but realistically, Defining which pension and which option to take is simple. If you can tell me exactly when you're going to die and exactly when your spouse is going to die.
Yes. Same goes to Social Security. When we're talking about Social Security options and who to take, when to take, who to take, when to take. But that's a great point. But kind of segueing off that, one thing that Social Security has is the cost of living adjustment. So you'll see that with Social Security, and that is going to be every year. They actually just released 2026's. The amount you receive for Social Security is going to be inflated, and it's based off the inflation rates at the time. Some pensions will have the cost of living adjustment, or it's also referred to as COLA. So some pensions will have that, but oftentimes they do not.
Usually they do not.
Typically they do not have the COLA for the pension. So if the $4,000 a month example we've been using, you're getting $4,000 a month every year for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter if inflation is 10%, you're getting $4,000. A lot of times, to Mike's point, there's no cost of living adjustments when it comes to pensions. We also touched a little bit earlier on normal retirement age, and then we briefly touched on early retirement age. So a lot of times with pensions, you're going to have every pension is going to have a normal retirement age. Typically it's 65. If you take it before that, it's considered a early retirement. Once again, it's not when you actually retire. The early retirement refers to when you begin collecting the benefit.
Correct.
So if you begin collecting it prior to the full retirement age, it's going to be reduced. And it makes sense because if you think about it from their perspective, the company's perspective, they're now having to pay you money for a longer period of time than they otherwise would have if you would have waited. So it's going to be a reduction. Now, how much that reduction is depends on your specific pension, and that'll be found in the summary plan description. And what I see a lot of times is that people are afraid to take the early benefit because they think, well, I don't want to take less. I like the idea of $4,000. I don't want to take less than that. And one thing we always like to do with the pensions too, we talked about the break-evens earlier for the lump sum versus the monthly, but we also run break-evens of taking it now versus waiting till your full retirement age. And what we're looking at there is we say, okay, well, if your full retirement age amount is $4,000 and your early retirement age amount is $3,500. One thing I think people forget is that they just focus on I'm getting $500 less a month, Nick. I'm not doing that. But what sometimes people forget is, yes, you're getting $500 less per month, but let's say you're taking it 5 years earlier than you would have if you waited till full retirement age. Well, now you're getting $3,500 a month for 5 years that you wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So when we're running the break evens, what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, you now have collected $3,500 a month for 5 years, and you now have a sum of money that either you used to spend or you didn't draw on your other assets. So essentially you're saving money in a way, and you now have a bucket there. How long does it take you to make up the difference? How long is that extra $500 that you'd be getting if you waited really take before it would have been worth, okay, well, how long did I have to live before it would have been worth waiting till your full retirement age? So we like to run that too. And a lot of times we'll actually have people begin collecting their pension early because of that. And because the break-even age is far out enough, we're saying, okay, well, for it to be worth it to you to wait till age 65, it's your age 88. So once you turn age 88, okay, yeah, Nick, you were wrong. We should have waited till the full retirement age.
One of the things that I've found is that it's somewhere in the 5 to 6% per year reduction is where the break even becomes questionable. At which point, then it's a lifestyle, it's understanding, longevity and everything else like that. But, the examples that we like to use, because this is the most common pension here in Pennsylvania, is PCERS. And those people retiring now are ones that were in the plan prior to 2011. And those are the ones where the full retirement age is age 60. But if they have 25 years in and began collecting pension, not retired, at age 55, the reduction's only 3% per year. So we have a client who is born, or shall I say, was 53 and a half, like 53 and 3/4 when she retired. Her birthday was in October. And what she did is she waited 1.25 years to reach her 55th birthday to turn on the pension, because at that point, her reduction was only 3% per year. And to your point, when we do the calculations, only a 3% reduction for 5 years, that's a 15% reduction, way worth it in their particular case. Now, I have another one where it was remarkable how their pension at age, I think it was 57, was $4,100 a month. Their pension at age 60 was $4,200. Their break even was age 212.
I wonder what you should do with that one.
All right. We're at a good point for a break. We'll be back with you in just a few moments and we'll pick up and wrap this episode up. So stay tuned. We'll be back with you in a few minutes.
Do you keep up regularly with your investments? Where exactly are your hard-earned dollars going? Are you financially prepared for an emergency?
I'm Mike Menninger, founder of Menninger Associates Financial Planning. We believe that education and knowledge are powerful, and we want our clients to understand why we are making the recommendations that we make. It's your money, and you deserve to know where it's going, because it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. So call us today to discuss your financial concerns. Welcome back. We're talking about pensions, and now we're going to talk about the taxation of pension, but most importantly, strategies and considerations of what to do and things to think about when deciding on a pension. So the one thing about pensions is, from a tax perspective, it's taxed identically at the federal and the state levels as they tax IRA distributions. So on the federal level, they tax it as ordinary income, but it is not taxed by wage tax, which is Social Security and Medicare. And it is not taxed locally because our local townships tax only earned income. Pennsylvania does not tax pensions. They only tax earned income and dividends, but they do not tax retirement income. You need to know and understand your state, which is really interesting because that can sometimes make the difference, which goes to your planning considerations. So let's say, for instance, I retired in Pennsylvania, but I'm thinking of moving south. Let's say, hypothetically, I'll pick South Carolina. South Carolina has a 7%, roughly, a 7% state tax that would be taxing my pension or my IRA. And so some of the things that we do as far as strategies is we say, whoa, let's think about the actual take home of this pension, meaning the annuity, the monthly payment. If I move into a higher tax state, I use South Carolina because it's 7%, which is relatively high. Moving to New York, New Jersey, California, and a lot of different states have a much higher tax, so that what sometimes makes sense is to take a lump sum as an IRA and you do a bunch of Roth IRA conversions while living in a tax-free state. And therefore you get it out and now you're improving. And now that's where you look at break-evens again, because the break-even, in effect, if I'm paying 7% South Carolina tax or 9% California tax or 6.5% or 7% New York State tax, then what I need to do is look at my $4,000 a month and say, it's not $4,000. I'm subtracting 7%. That's $280. My pension is now actually $3,720. So we model that and see if there's a difference when taking a look at break even, et cetera, et cetera. So do not underestimate the impact of taxes whenever it comes to any type of evaluation, especially with pensions.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more planning that goes into where you live than sometimes people think about. And that's specifically with retirement, because people just think, oh, I want to, maybe they live up north, they want to move down south. And to your point, South Carolina, people aren't thinking about those things. So I think it's very important to understand how your state tax rules work and how where you may want to move to's state tax rules work, because there are very nifty things and very creative things you can do if you're moving from a state like Pennsylvania, where Roth conversions aren't taxed at the state level. Social Security is not taxed at the state level. Pensions, IRAs, all that fun stuff are not taxed at the state level. And you're moving to a state that does tax them. There's things you should be doing before you move.
Right. Exactly. And so looking again at the tax piece, okay, sometimes you may find yourself in an extraordinarily low income tax bracket for the first 3 or 4 years out of retirement. And when you're collecting the pension, I was referencing the Roth IRA conversions. If you have a lot of other assets that are pre-tax, you can convert, to Roth IRA, pay the taxes at the lower rate so that you can grab those assets in retirement. But when it comes to pensions, there is a lot of tax planning that goes with it. Now, I keep referring to PEACers. Why? Because PEACers, quite frankly, the very first PEACers, the one that was prior to 2011, is the richest pension plan I've ever encountered. And that includes all kinds of different corporations, the federal government, big tech, pharma, you name it. So knowing that, and knowing that a pension can have adverse tax implications on people in retirement, there's planning that you should be doing today to avoid that, because remarkably, people find themselves more often than not, when they have a pension, they're in a higher income tax bracket in retirement, which goes against normal thinking or conventional thinking. You're like, dude, I'm making $250,000 today or $300,000 household income. I got no income in retirement except this dinky little $4,000 a month pension. But what's the pension doing? The pension's turning around, causing Social Security to become taxable. And then subsequent to that, you may also have other income that's going to potentially come in and cause your Medicare premiums to become taxable. This is a recurring theme that we keep talking about, but it is a tax planning consideration that do not underestimate the impact of your pension on future taxation. So you need to be thinking about that right now. And we're having discussions with almost every person I run into who's a teacher or who has a pension, and we're dealing with someone over this past weekend. We're like, immediately flip to the Roth 401k because it's going to benefit them later. Okay. Talk about some other considerations when it comes to pensions.
Yeah, there's a lot of planning to be done around which option do you take, and what are some of the considerations if you're going we talked a lot about kind of the lump sum versus the monthly payment and why you'd want to take one or the other there. But one thing you also want to consider too when you're determining lump sum versus monthly, or if you're doing the monthly, do I do 100% survivorship, 50% survivor, whatever that magic number is, there's a few other things you want to keep in mind. One, does your spouse have a pension? Because if they have a pension, well, maybe you don't need the survivorship option as much, depending on how much their pension is. Maybe that's why you could afford to go 50% versus 100% survivorship. Another thing we also factor in too when determining specifically survivorship is Social Security. I know one thing we did within the past year was we said, all right, well, the husband's Social Security was higher. And what we're actually doing is we're delaying collecting his until his full retirement age. And because we're doing that, we're actually doing just the single life for he has 3 pensions. So for 2 of the 3, we're doing the single life because we know, okay, if he passes away, she's going to get some of the one pension and also getting stepped up to his Social Security. So the need to have the survivorship options on 2 of now they were the smaller pensions, the 2 of the smaller pensions is less. So that is a consideration too, Social Security. Another consideration with the pensions that Mike touched on was the taxation. You taking the pension is potentially going to cause some of your Social Security to be taxable. And when it goes back to the lump sum versus the monthly, the lump sum can afford that flexibility where maybe you can better manage your tax situation because you're not having to take $4,000 if you don't need it, and just gives you a little bit more flexibility there too. Another thing you want to consider when you're determining which pension option you're going to go with is how old are you? How old are your spouse? Is your spouse? That's going to factor in as to whether or not you go one option or the other. Health is also a concern and a massive concern. If health is not on your side or you have a family medical history that's not the best, there's not really longevity in your family, well then that's probably going to determine which of the options you choose. If you don't have longevity on your side and maybe your spouse is younger than you, well then the survivorship, maybe the period certain, the lump sum may make more sense because if you're not going to be there to collect it and you're doing the max single life annuity, that doesn't make sense if you don't think you're going to be collecting it for a long period of time. So there's definitely a lot of considerations that go into which option you do and when you take it.
Well, and the other thing too is that if you don't have beneficiaries, if you don't have beneficiaries, we ran into this just recently as well, then why do you need to leave money for somebody else? You may as well consider the single life. There's just, again, that's just another thing to take into consideration. And again, the spouse's income, their social security, there's a lot of different things that take into consideration.
And one other thing while we're talking about that, and you kind of touched on it with the individual that's single, no beneficiaries, why the heck do I need to leave any money behind? Another thing to factor in too, and the one element that we haven't really touched on of the lump sum versus the payment is the risk associated with it. Because if you take out that lump sum, it is going to be invested. Now, the level of risk that you take is up to you, but some people don't want to take any risk. And if that's the case, well, then maybe the monthly payment makes sense for you because you're guaranteed, okay, I'm getting $4,000 a month. I don't have to worry about the investments. And for some people, that's all they want. And that's okay too.
So lastly, you do have some estate planning considerations. And what you might find is that, with a mixed marriage, so to speak, where it's a second marriage, you want to make sure that you're protecting your spouse, but without going through complex estate planning, you may choose that the annuity type of pension is better served than the lump sum. Because if you leave the lump sum to your spouse, there's always that risk she remarries, the money goes to the new spouse, or the money goes to her children and not yours. There's just a lot of considerations. So we're going to wrap up here. If we hadn't demonstrated it before, okay, or if you hadn't figured it out by now, there's a whole lot more to pension planning, understanding the pension, understanding how the pension works and how it fits in to your particular situation. If you have a pension, I applaud you. Be thankful because you're one of the few. And so, again, just do proper planning. So thank you for joining us. Nick, thank you for joining me again.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you learned something. And, if this might apply to you, I would strongly encourage that you reach out to your financial planner. And if you don't have a financial planner, or if you'd like to give us a call, we could be reached at 610-422-3773. Or I encourage you to check out our website, which is www.maaplanning.com. Thank you, and you have an absolutely wonderful day and terrific week.